So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our free webinar, Upskilling for Qatarization, Advancing ESG and Sustainability to Align with Qatar Vision 2030. We are thrilled to have, of course, you joining us here today. To begin, of course, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Cheska Arenas, the Senior Business Development Executive here at DISS, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Just a quick reminder for everyone joining us here today. This webinar will run for approximately 45 minutes. Please keep your microphones muted during the presentation to minimize background noise. If you have questions, feel free to drop it in the chat box anytime. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end. This session is being, of course, recorded, and we will share the recording and materials after the webinar. Lastly, please be aware that we will be capturing screenshots and photos, which will be shared across our social media platforms. So we kindly request you to turn on your camera so we can see all your beautiful faces, of course. All right, so let's get started. I know everyone's excited. So I'll just have a quick introduction for our guest speakers today. They will be, of course, explaining further what they're doing and what their expertise are. But of course, with that, it's my pleasure to introduce one of the managing directors of Viridian Ventures. He is a sustainability expert with deep expertise in ESG, carbon markets, and corporate sustainability. He focuses on leading impact-focused workshops and guiding businesses in effectively integrating sustainable practices. Let's welcome, of course, Mr. Joe Saab. And, of course, the beautiful lady that will be joining him. Hi, Joe. Please wave
Hi,
for everyone to see.
can you guys hear
All
me?
right. Yes. Everyone
Amazing.
can see you. Okay. And of course, our second speaker, she is a sustainability expert too, with 7 years of experience in corporate sustainability and ESG compliance. She has worked with organizations to develop strategic frameworks, assess environmental and social risks, and successfully integrate ESG principles into core business operations. Please welcome Ms. Sukaina Fadli, the head of ESG services. Sukaina, please wave to everyone so everyone can see you.
Hello,
All
everyone.
right. So at this juncture, I will be, of course, turning over the spotlight to Joe and Sukaina. So welcome, everyone. Let's get started.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you, first of all, Cheska, for this amazing introduction. I just want to start by asking if everybody can see my screen that I've already shared, if it's visible to everybody. Okay, amazing. So yes, as Cheska talked about today we'll be diving into the upskilling for Qatarization. And 1 second, let me see if I can. So we've already discussed the trainers, so we won't spend too much time on that. But yes, as Cheska mentioned, I'm the managing director of Viridian Ventures, and Sukaina is the head of ESG. And today we'll be talking about what is actually Qatarization and what does that mean in terms of ESG embedding into Qatar itself. So we'll be covering these two aspects cooperatively. First of all, welcome to the webinar, and thank you so much for taking the time to listen in and talk about this. We're very excited to actually start talking about this idea more and more, as you're going to see it appear more and more throughout Qatar, throughout its public sectors, or private sectors. But in a nutshell, we often discuss sustainability and Qatarization as separate priorities, as you can read. And today we're going to be doing the opposite of that. We're going to be reverse engineering it, and actually talking about both and how they cross-pollinate, right? So one of the key takeaways for this session, before I get into it, is what we're trying to do is understand what ESG is at first level, right? Why it matters for businesses in Qatar. We'll touch a little bit on the GCC after. And we'll start actually by learning how Qatarization and sustainability goals are actually deeply connected. So we'll look at the aspects of Qatarization, what it means. We'll discuss that and we'll get into it in just a minute. And then we'll go and see how that actually crosses over sustainability, excuse me. And then, of course, we're going to just dive into a little bit with the time that we have. We're going to explore the business case for ESG training and workforce development. As I'm sure a lot of you are coming from possible oil and gas, construction, different sectors throughout Qatar. So we'll try to relate that a little bit. And we want to walk away at the end of it. Well, you would like to walk away with a bit of practical steps to start integrating or start understanding how you can integrate sustainability into your organization and learning and development strategies. And as Jessica, of course, said, any questions, please feel free to drop them after. We'll be more than happy to ask. And if we don't have time, we'll make sure to send you an email responding to it. So we'll start with pillar one, right? What is actually Qatarization? What does that actually mean? We're going to take a step back before we get into sustainability and just do a bit of just basic understanding of what it means, the Qatarization, what it actually has to do with the vision of 2030. So Qatarization is deeply embedded within the government. It's a government-led national strategy, and it's designed to, at its core, increase participation of Qatari nationals in key sectors, one of those being energy, education, healthcare, and finance. And the core objective, if we want to look at it like that, if we want to summarize the entire thing, is it wants to ensure that 50% or more key positions are held by qualified Qatari nationals, providing meaningful permanent employment. That's basically the move on from just understanding what it actually is to be leading in energy, education, healthcare, and finance, right? And why does this matter? And this way, it matters because it builds national capacity. They want to enhance the economic resilience from the inside out instead of heavily relying on importing intelligence, basically. And that's basically what Qatarization actually means. Now, when it comes to the pillars of Qatarization, we look at four of them, right? The main one is human development, social development, economic, and an environmental development. Now, the human development part is developing of all Qatar's people to enable them to sustain a prosperous society. Now, if we start slowly moving into the ESG aspect of that, and why you might be thinking, why does this actually matter in terms of sustainability, is because when you embed sustainability within your systems, within your structures, however that being said, you actually cover all of those combined, right? So if you enable sustainability within the core functions of your company, right, and this is just at a very high level, we haven't started to dig deep. I'm just speaking from a very high kind of a bird's eye view, as we say. You do tick all four of the boxes. So sustainability allows you to focus on human development, social development, as well as economic and, of course, environmental development being the core of sustainability itself. So as I was saying here, Qatarization directly contributes to the human development aspect, right? It crosses over with training and local development, and Qatarization is at the center of that. So what we're saying here is that by that four pillars that we just discussed about, and its national vision of 2030 that we'll dig more deep into later, it actually starts by talking about human development, right? But once I actually include sustainability in the beginning, beginning embedding, I actually immediately cross over economic, social, and environmental. And this is kind of sort of what I said before. And what does that mean? It means you build a more locally driven green economy. That's the economic development, social, the community involvement, and equity employment starts to look more transparent. The environmental development, of course, that's basically empowering nationals to lead climate initiatives. And this can be anything from ESG reporting, sustainability, urban planning. I'm sure some of you that know in construction that can be more looking at leadership in energy, environment, and development qualifications. That could be looking at more solar-powered energy or hydro-powered. I mean, anything that has to do with renewable energy, which actually we see already Qatar starting to embed that at a high case, moving more into solar. But this is what we're trying to say here in a nutshell is, once you deploy sustainability within the core functions, you already hit on these four elements that we just talked about. Now, how does that actually turn into ESG? Basically, Qatarization and ESG are, as I've been saying for the past 5 minutes, they're mutually, they reinforce each other. Where ESG and Qatarization actually overlap is that it focuses on recruitment in ESG heavy industries, and in terms of oil and gas, infrastructure and finances being prioritized for national hires. And we see now that there's a rising demand for specialized ESG skills. This comes into the thing of actually one of the main things that needs to happen for them to overlap by the Qatari 2020-30 vision is that there needs to be a knowledge transfer. So a lot of these roles that I just spoke about, when it comes to where they sit in terms of ESG, are actually sitting from the outside in, meaning people coming with those skill sets that come in here and teach. And we want to transfer that knowledge towards a more local standard, if that makes sense. Now, in terms of actionable steps, right, for these four pillars that I just spoke about, what does that mean for human development, right? It means educating and training Qatari nationals to lead sustainability initiatives, as simple as that is. And then basically what that means is to create also career pathways where sustainability becomes the focus. And as I mentioned, whether that's oil and gas. So I'll give a quick example. If we look at, let's say, oil and gas, and you want to start by reducing your carbon emissions, right? this could be creating a carbon strategy from the get-go and embedding it in the education of how you can start looking at your scope 1, your scope 2, your scope 3. And I'm not sure many of you even know what these are yet because they're not very popular, but that's ways on how decarbonize your entire structure. And I know it sounds counterintuitive for some of you, because how can you say, Joe, how can I say oil and gas and say decarbonization? Well, in fact, there are ways to do that. And we do see our neighboring companies starting to do that, whether that's in the UAE, whether that's Oman. And we see now Qatar is starting to look at that as well, right? As Qatar Energy, some of its policies have come out to start embedding what we call decarbonization. And the way to do that would be by emitting your carbon CO2. And there's many ways to start emitting CO2, and we'll get into that after. And then in terms of, but I just want to stick to these 4 right now. But so in terms of economic development, as I just mentioned, you want to start supporting a low diversified carbon economy. And there's so many ways that you can actually start embedding that within on a macro and micro scale. And then you want to build economic resilience through local green jobs. This is something that we see very often being done in Europe. It becomes a core function. So I'll give you a quick example, such as health and safety. Back in the day, it wasn't very important. Now it's mandatory. The same goes for human resources. HR development, HR functions weren't very important back then. Now it's a core part of a company. So this is kind of how they're looking at putting it in. It becomes a core function on what builds a foundation of a company, whether that's in construction, oil and gas. And then you have social development. That's basically creating a more ethical governance and community engagement, more environmental community events and standards that you see more embedded within the actual community itself and the local population. And then when it comes to environmental development, the actionable steps can look into building local expertise in ESG, in climate change, and in green innovation, strengthening national capacity to manage the natural resources and reduce national impact, reduce environmental impact. And what I meant by that is, in the beginning, I mentioned some of those can be whether you look at decarbonization as it's a main pillar when it comes to climate change and how we want to move forward into that climate economy. That would be a major one, right? Is how do you actually decarbonize an oil-based economy or a construction-based economy? And there's many ways to do that, whether you're in construction, oil and gas, or actually FMCG companies. All of these, there's many different ways to start. So without further ado, this is just the core functions of what we say the Qatarization. And now I'm going to give it to Sukaina to actually move into what understanding as an isolation of what is sustainability in ESG. So without further ado, Sukaina, please go ahead.
Okay, so we've heard a couple of terms that Joe just mentioned. So there's decarbonization, sustainability, ESG. There's quite a few terms that I'm sure you've heard before and don't necessarily know what they mean. So now let's take a step back and ground ourselves in the fundamentals. We'll start with the 2 terms that are most likely going to be used interchangeably, but they don't necessarily mean the same thing, which are sustainability and ESG. So these 2 terms get thrown around quite a lot, but it's essential that we all speak the same language in the context of Qatarization and so on. So first, ESG, what is it? Let's start with sustainability first. So sustainability is, at its core, simply means that you're able to meet, as a country, you're able to meet today's needs without compromising the ability for future generations to meet the needs. So it essentially combines 3, what we call the 3 Ps: the people, the planet, and the profit. So the country is able to sustainably meet future generations' needs. That is what sustainability means, whereas ESG it's more of a human-made concept, and it's essentially the operational framework that helps businesses apply sustainability in a way that's measurable and strategic. Essentially, what ESG stands for is environmental, social, and governance. So these are essentially the 3 lenses that we use today to assess how sustainable a company is. So in the past, you had most investment decisions were driven by how purely financial a return on investment is, but now there's a shift in how things are viewed. So essentially, we're asking deeper questions. So how does this business impact, or how does this company impact the environment? How does it treat its people and its human capital? And how is it governed? So in terms of leadership, how is it governed at the top? So let's break down these pillars one by one. First, there's the environmental. essentially what does that mean is that how a company impacts nature and the environment in which it operates. Is the company managing its energy emission, its energy use, or the carbon emissions that it emits in the air? Something that Joe mentioned recently, decarbonization is just means limiting the emissions that you put out in nature. And there's waste, which is a huge component as well. That simply means is the company trying to reduce the footprint or the waste that it emits? And this is something that maybe overlaps with the health and safety aspect of things. And then we have social, which focuses more on people. So that's purely on how the company treats its employees and its human capital. Is it an equitable environment? Does it keep its workplaces safe? Does it engage the communities around it? And third pillar is governance, and that's heavily focused on leadership. So is the company transparent? For example, is there board accountability? Do they have systems in place to prevent corruption or to promote ethical decision-making? These are essentially the questions that you ask when talking about sustainability or ESG specifically. So the one takeaway here is that I want you to, when you think of ESG, it's not purely about environment or being green. It's also about building trust. It's about managing risk and hopefully unlocking like long-term value for all stakeholders involved. And this is why we're going to revert back to our initial topic. This is why we think ESG needs to be taught to Qatari professionals in the context of Qatarization, because we're not just teaching policy. They need to be given the tools to lead in climate strategy, green investment, ethical business transformation, which is essentially the North Star of the country for the next 5 years till 2030. Yeah, so we'll break down some of these topics a little bit more. So we've covered what it means in general. Now we're gonna look into what each of these topics means, or the under subtopics that it holds. So under environmental, you're most likely going to hear about carbon emissions, which we've mentioned, energy efficiency, so how efficient is the energy use, how much water usage the company has, and how it manages its waste, and how essentially they're mitigating pollution. This is something that is mentioned in health and safety. We'll touch on the overlap in a bit. The social pillar touches on diversity workplace, labor practices, ethical, transparent supply chains. So your suppliers, how ethical are they? That's usually something that companies try to outsource to their suppliers and they're not responsible for. But now with the new regulation that's coming, they're also held accountable for their supply chain, environmental footprint and social footprint. And then we have governance. So some of the KPIs that are mentioned on here is, are the board members diverse and independent? Are there any safeguards against bribery and corruption? And then you can go further in detail. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to break these down one by one, but I just wanted to give a general bird's eye view of all the KPIs and how complex this can get. Yeah, so essentially this summarizes, that ESG is usually used as a buzzword, but there needs to be a business strategy behind it, and there needs to be a roadmap for implementation. Moving on to the next idea that we want to emphasize on, which is the shift from health and safety to ESG, which I think is the most natural progression within a company. Sometimes when first integrating sustainability in a company, you're not sure what department to put it on. And some do that under PR and marketing and communications department, but then it's only focused on the communication aspect. What we suggest is that the shift needs to happen from a health and safety department to an ESG department. And there's a simple reason for that, and we'll go right into that. So essentially, I'm sure you're aware, EHS stands for Environment, Health, and Safety, and it has long been a pillar in operations, especially in heavy industries, construction, manufacturing, and essentially focuses on minimizing harm, protecting employees, ensuring safe workplaces. Which, if you've been listening so far, there's quite a bit of an overlap between that and ESG. So essentially, the idea is that health and safety is not replaced by ESG. It's simply it evolves into it. So the ESG overlaps heavily with the environmental side of environment, health, and safety. So there's covering pollution emissions, there's regulatory compliance. It's just that ESG is, think of it as a step further. If we could just move to the next slide. Yeah. So in many ways, I was just saying that environment, health, and safety is just a subset of ESG, and then you want to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. So the safety functions now sit within the wider strategy of regulatory pressures and the corporate goals in general. But what we're pushing towards is that the health and safety department should be trained on ESG to make that transition. And one more point that I would like to mention is that it's essentially the same direction, although the different frameworks impact different stakeholders within the group. So ESG is quite strategic. It's influencing investors, stakeholders. It's addressing additional issues like governance, ethics, and climate, whereas environmental health and safety is a bit more operational. It's affecting regulators, it's affecting vendors, frontline workers. So it's a bit more compliance heavy. So there's a bit of an overlap, as you can see here.
Hello? Is Sukaina, can everybody hear Sukaina?
No, is Sukaina?
Yes, we are here.
Wait, can everybody hear
No.
me?
Yes, we can hear you, Joe.
Yes,
I can hear
can
you.
hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, so just summarizing, there's quite a bit of an overlap, which is why I think the strategic decision would be to train the environment, health, and safety on the additional topics that are not included, and to add the strategic component by putting a governance structure within the company. That's essentially it. We can now move on to the key global and regional ESG drivers.
Yeah, okay, go ahead. I think I moved on to this slide. Please go ahead.
Okay, so we've explained what ESG means. Now that we've covered the what, we're going to move to the why. And essentially, we're going to zoom out to see the bigger picture of why the country why is there this massive shift in how businesses are operating? Why do we even care about sustainability? Well, there's a general push in terms of regulation. So now it's becoming mandatory. In the GCC specifically, but globally and everywhere in the world. And that ripple effect is getting to the GCC specifically. So the UAE and Saudi Arabia are also putting together net zero targets and sovereign ESG frameworks. And here in Qatar also, ESG is becoming tightly woven into the national strategy, as we've mentioned, and there's specific targets that are to be met within 5 years frame, which is quite a big achievement to make. So we're going to cover some of the frameworks and regulations that if you are to enter this field, you should be familiar with that are most relevant for Qatar specifically. So we have the SDGs. The SDGs were adopted a long time ago by the UN in 2015, and it's essentially just a framework that gives the general direction on the urgent challenges that different companies should be able to prioritize, and each country should participate in this global framework essentially. So there's a couple of SDGs, which is simply stands for Sustainable Development Goal. That is particularly relevant for companies. There's responsible production and consumption. They're supporting climate change and water management and clean energy. So you're starting to see the overlap between some topics that keep repeating themselves. We have promoting transparency and accountability and ethical governance, which is the G in ESG. And the goal would be to help Qatar's private sector align with international sustainability frameworks. And this is one of the most prominent. This is the one that you will hear the most about. But there's quite a few. So we're just trying to keep it short and cover the most prominent ones. The next one I want to mention that's extremely relevant, and all of these are available publicly. You could look at them. There's the Qatar Stock Exchange ESG framework. If we could just go to the next slide.
The next one.
Yes, so we're just going to quickly talk about the Qatar ESG framework. As you can see here on a little table, it's very similar to the topics that we've mentioned before. So these were developed. This is a framework that's heavily inspired from a global one called the GRI. And essentially this framework for ESG topics and compliance was developed to encourage all the listed companies in Qatar to improve their sustainability transparency and reporting. So now all listed companies in Qatar have to, it's not mandatory, it's not mandatory yet, but all companies that are listed have to report on their sustainability measures, which is why you see this suddenly picking up in Qatar specifically. And
I was answering the question. Sorry, because we saw the question pop up, so she answered it quickly. for anybody hearing, go ahead.
Yeah, we're just answering the question that asked if this is mandatory or not. So yeah, that's essentially the context. But we were just saying that this is not mandatory yet. It is heavily inclined. Companies are heavily inclined to do so if they are to be listed or go public. And we see a few already. If you're interested in this, you can go to the Qatar Stock Exchange portal, and then you can also see a listing of all the companies and their current sustainability report. And yeah, you're free to go over that. And something else that you should be aware about is Qatar's environmental climate change strategy. So Qatar has goals to meet, and they've, if you could just move to the next slide, Joe.
Yes, sorry. The one after?
Yeah, this is Qatar's national and climate change strategy. You're also free to go over the Ministry of Environment's website and go over the reports in details. And it just outlines essentially the national commitments that Qatar is to meet, which is essentially reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is synonymous to the term decarbonization, which Joe mentioned earlier. Improve the air quality and water quality, preserve the biodiversity and ecosystems of the country, and also promote water efficiency and energy efficiency. And yeah, that's essentially very ambitious goals that Qatar has in place, which is why it's important to train the workforce to meet those ambitious targets. So this is just an overview of what we just mentioned. We have the Qatar Stock Exchange this ESG disclosure. We have the National Environmental and Climate Change Strategy, which you can find on the Ministry's Environment website, and the Qatar National Vision, which we've mentioned early on, with 4 pillars: environmental, human, social, and economic. That just gives you an idea about where the North Star of Qatar in terms of economy is going. And yeah, this is essentially covers the why this is so important for us to start integrating slowly ESG training. And now we're going to talk about why we should move from traditional compliance training to specifically strategic ESG upskilling. So we mentioned earlier that there is a strategic component to ESG, as environmental health and safety is purely operational. So as companies grow and these ESG expectations that we've just mentioned increased, we sort of move up the pyramid, or we are supposed to move up the pyramid to include ESG elements as a company. And things like waste reduction, diversity and inclusion, You can see here on the graph scope 1 and 2, it means just the company's carbon emissions on their operations. And then as we evolve from that, the end goal would be to move at the top of the pyramid and reach full sustainability maturity or full ESG maturity, and include also the supply chain. So each company includes the suppliers that it deals with, and includes stakeholder engagement and a climate strategy.
And sorry, before we move on, I just want to mention for anybody listening, I would advise, we won't get into it now, but I would highly advise after this meeting or whenever you have some time, just look up what scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 means. And I think it would give you a very high-end understanding of what we're speaking about in more detail. Because once you understand what it means to calculate scope 1, scope 2, and why actually scope 3 sits at the top of the pyramid, and why it's actually as difficult as it is to actually, in a nutshell, it's the hardest carbon emissions to calculate. It's in terms of GHG, and then look at what every one of them actually means. What scope 1 means, what it means to calculate 2, and then what it means to calculate scope 3, and why most companies have a hard time with scope 3. Just wanted to mention that out there.
So just to wrap up this pillar, so that we're running short of time, this is essentially this section of the webinar was to cover that the general direction where Qatar is heading, and the general ambition levels that have been clearly communicated and that companies need to get on board on. And to get there, we need to train people who can operate across all these layers, not just the base layer that we've mentioned. So compliance is essentially the floor, and we're trying to get to the ceiling. So strategic ESG upskilling is how we build the rest of that structure.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sukaina, for this. So now I'm going to get into more on the technical and practical steps. And this is our final pillar. What I'll do is I'll try to be a little quicker because I think we're running a bit out of time. Thank you for the link for the Qatar National Environment and Climate Strategy. I love when people are proactive during our seminar, so I really appreciate that. And so now I'm going to get into pillar 3 and practical steps for organizations. So for basically you people or organizations day to day, how would you implement this, right? So from a compliance to strategy is how I'm going to look at it. So compliance is basically when a company says, or when a government says, hey, listen, you need to do this, whether you like it or not. It becomes a business incentive, or you want to avoid fees, right? And this is you're going to see it in Qatar now. Anybody that wants to be listed on the stock, whether that's in the Abu Dhabi Stock Exchange or the Qatar Stock Exchange, across the GCC, you need to see something called an ESG report, which basically helps you. It's not helps you, sorry, it's mandatory for you to be listed on there. So how do we do this? So I want to do it'll be 5 minutes quick. What you first have to do is articulate an ambition. So if you're somebody sitting you're a project manager, okay, and I'll give the example, we'll get into a practical space. You want to build a building, you understand you're in construction, you understand this is where the company level is at. You want to, first of all, we have a meeting, let's say you articulate where your ambition level is. You can come and say, hey, Joe, actually, I want to get Platinum LEED certified, which is the highest certification for LEED. For some of you that don't know, LEED is basically Leadership in Energy and Environmental Development, or whether it's an ISO certification. But these sort of certifications usually cost money, so they have to have planning before. Because if let's say I want to go for a platinum certification, then there's a lot of strategy I have to do before. You cannot build a building and say, hey, then I want to be platinum certified. Right? You have to plan that before. So this is why articulating an ambition level matters a lot. And then going back, let's say you want to emit 80% of your GHG emissions. That's going to be very difficult to actually do and actually report on if you don't start from the beginning. If you don't say that in the beginning, if you don't look at your finances and see how much you want to allocate, if you don't say how many people you want building an ESG report, whether you want that to import it, to export it, how you'd want to look at your vendors, how you'd want to look at where you get your, let's say you're building, where you get your cement from, where you get your steel from, how you want to localize it as much as possible, right? Then what we do is we assess a maturity level. And what that means is where you currently stand on now. Usually that's done with a consultant or somebody internally. They measure where you are now. They assess where do I as a company stand now in your respective sector. And to do that, this is the thing about sustainability that we kind of face a problem in a lot. They think it's as an isolated thing that I can just give to somebody that's sitting in marketing or give to somebody that's sitting in finance. It usually tends to fail that way. Why? Because when we assess maturity, we have to look at every single every single department in the company has to provide some sort of value. That's the only way it works, which is why it usually ends up being a lot more expensive if you don't do your ambitious level, and it ends up being a lot more complicated and it takes a lot more time. Because the actual reportings, if you want to do a GRI reporting, or if you want to do a scope 3 emissions calculations to meet, let's say, an SBTI, I mean, don't worry about these now. They might sound like complicated terms, but in reality, they're not once you actually do a bit of research on them. You understand that takes a lot more prep than we think, right? So after you've done your ambition level, then after you've done a maturity assessment with all your respective departments and see, hey, this is where I want to be. Let's say, and I'll go with the case of construction. Let's say I want LEED Gold and I want to have 30% of my GHG emitted by the next 5 years, right? That's a perfect way to come to somebody like us or whoever you choose to, or even internally, and say, hey, these are the goals I want to meet. This is the finance I want to allocate for it. Then we begin, or whoever it is, begins to design a sustainability strategy to actually meet those goals. Because that strategy, let's say for an emission reduction, can't be done in a couple of months. It's usually a 1 to 3 to 4 or 5 years actually strategy. And then we design the actual framework where you transform up to the government structure. And this is a lot of times where we basically do the training and mobilize an organization in order to meet those demands. And then after that's done, after we're trained, after we've done our frameworks, we actually monitor the progress. And then you go to report and communicate those efforts. Because to be very honest, once you've done all this work, a lot of companies don't want to keep it a secret, right? A lot of companies want to say, because why? Because if I'm a company and I want to use this as a competitive advantage, I'm going to be doing that. If I have an ESG report and I've emitted 80% of my GHG emissions, I'm not going to keep that in the backlog. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to put my marketing there. I'm going to make sure that I report on it, right? And I'm saying this besides the mandatory reporting. You want to be able to report on your efforts, because by definition, it gives you a competitive advantage in the market. Yeah. Right now, let's say I don't want to cross over into Europe, but just say Europe is a lot more advanced in that sector, or let's say Singapore, you won't be able to make it as a company. There's no chance you would survive as a company for 2 years if you don't have a proper sustainability strategy embedded within your organization, right? So we're saying that now, where some of you might say, I don't really care about it. You might not care about it in terms of its actual impact. But once it becomes an integral part of if your companies will be able to function in the next 4 years, then that's when people start paying attention. And that's when we start seeing those efforts and communication efforts come in. I don't know if I make sense to everybody here, but I'm just showing you, because a lot of you, which I did when I first came to the GCC, I was like, but that's not really, to be honest, I don't really care, right? Which is very fair. You shouldn't really care. But from a business perspective and from an impact perspective, it doesn't matter if you care. You're going to have to care, right? Because it's going to be embedded in the actual system of your company. And if you don't learn about it, then you're going to be backlogged. And if you get backlogged, then you lose your competitive advantage in the market. It's as simple as that. And we've seen this happen again and again, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in the Middle East, or even in the United States. But anyways, we're going to keep focusing on here because we see the shift now. So back to the technical understanding of it, and I'll try to hurry up. Designing your sustainability transformation requires both technical and strategic competence, right? So what does that mean? When you look at technical competence, you have to integrate the ESG into the enterprise risk. And then at the same time, this is why we've had those kind of sin like this, you need a strategic competence. So you need somebody to go in and transform your organization internally. You need somebody to start looking at your project managers and discussing how they should be thinking, at the same time creating an ESG performance map, or saying, hey, I'm going to start. I mean, one of the first things that, to be honest, we didn't touch on a lot, but it's the core function of everything we're speaking about now, which I'm sure many of you know, is data, right? Data, think about it as the king of the hill here, right? Without data, you have nothing, right? And when I say nothing, I don't mean literally nothing, but you have nothing in terms of mandatory compliance and to moving in. Whether that's when you want to do a lead, you need data. Whether you want to do a reporting, you need data. Whether you even want to start anything regarding sustainability. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you know this in terms of what you're doing business as usual now in your respective sectors. Data is the key to driving all this change, because data allows for action. And so why I stopped on that so much is because data will allow you to create those reporting systems, whether that's GRI, SASB, TCFD, you'll see those later on. But as you move over, right, with a company-wide enablement, as you see it in the center stone of the circle, you'll understand that that will get you to, in terms of technical competence, operational excellence, and measurable impact, which I just spoke about. Anything measurable, you need data. And then cultural embedding. So one of the problems that a lot of managers, I don't know if we have a lot of managers here, but a lot of managers, people that sit at head of safety, will come to us and say, what does it matter? Why can't I just do the technical, get it done with, do my reporting and go home? It doesn't work that way. Why? Because if you don't embed the people on your day-to-day to understand why you're doing this, why is this major change coming into my company? Why is it now that we care about sustainability? All right, you will lose the effort to gather the right amount of data. That goes hand in hand, and you see that time and time again. So this is basically, we didn't want to go into too much detail because, to be honest, what I just spoke about, this slide alone can go on for another 3 hours, right? To more details. But I'm going to stop it now. And I know we don't have much time. So we're going to do a quick suggested roadmap. So Ken's going to take over that quickly. And then we're going to head into what ESG means for business and then call it there. And we'd be happy to ask you to get your questions after that. So Sukaina, please go ahead.
Right. So now that we've just covered, we've just thrown a lot of information your way. You must be wondering, okay, but where do I start? We have a suggested roadmap for you in terms of actionable steps. So the first, as we mentioned earlier, you absolutely need to assess your status quo and your maturity level. If you want to reduce your emissions within the next 3 years, you need to know what your emissions are or what your energy consumption is today. So first, you have to conduct a comprehensive analysis and identify key areas of your operation, and these change from one sector to another. So this assessment just allows you to basically know all the critical issues and what you need to prioritize, and set the stage for what's to come later, which is a materiality analysis. So we've mentioned prioritizing. We've covered all the ESG topics under environmental social governance. There's quite a few. It's virtually impossible to do all of those at once. And also, you don't need to, because some are absolutely irrelevant in some industries as opposed to others. For example, if you're working in the hardware industry, or as opposed to the software industry, there's this most impactful topics are completely different. In hardware, the most impactful sustainability topic would be conflict minerals that go into the hardware that you use. As opposed to software, for example, there's no physical product in that industry. So the most impactful topic would be energy consumption and data servers that are used to run your softwares. So you have to, based on your industry, do a materiality analysis, which is just a fancy word to say prioritization analysis, to help you define all the strategic ESG topics that are aligned with your organization's business model and core objectives, so that you're able to embed this in a way that's most impactful. And this has to be done with a stakeholder engagement. So you have to get all stakeholder involved, from C-suite to all the departments that are relevant, internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. If you could just go back to step 3, no worries, then that would take you to the third and important, most debatably the most important one, which is putting in governance structure. You need to have a very clear governance structure that has assigned ownership. And as Joe mentioned, ideally that needs to be trickled across different departments, not as a standalone one person that's responsible as sustainability manager. What we suggest is to have a sustainability manager in place, but then to have a sustainability champion in each different department, be it in procurement, be it in technical or process engineering, and so on, so that you have everybody involved and participating in the ESG strategy. And then you're able to have somebody to be held responsible, and also allow cross-functional collaboration between different departments. And that takes us to the fourth step, which is to ensure capacity building. So once you have assigned governance structure, you have assigned ownership of these topics, you have to make sure that these people are properly trained. So upskilling teams across all levels. But the most important one usually is that the C-suite and board level need to be trained on sustainability topics, because otherwise what we've noticed is that there's usually a lot of the financing needs to be approved by the C-suite and the upper management. So it's also very important to have at board level to have them involved in the strategy. Step 5 is where you start bringing all these people together and ideating and prioritizing measures to implement. So once we get to this step, we have to implement and track all the prioritized measures of the topics that we just previously mentioned by embedding these into core business operations, and then from that, deducing specific KPIs to keep monitoring across every reporting year. And this is very different based on whatever topic we decide. So we just gave 2 examples. For example, if you're focusing on procurement department, then their task would be to filter all the suppliers based on their sustainability criteria. Are these suppliers certified? Are they not certified? Are they trained on ESG? Are they not? So there's a set of criteria to filter your suppliers on. The first level would be to train them as well. If we could just go back. And if we're talking about facilities, for example, or the more operational departments in your team, we could talk about optimizing your HVAC systems to reduce energy consumption. So these are just 2 examples. This would be very different based on which department we're talking about. And then step 6 is to keep track of the KPIs that we've just mentioned, to gather data from all these different moving parts and all these different departments and sustainability champions, and aggregate that information to be able to report and communicate it, and be able to, just share that with the relevant stakeholders. And that needs to be done in alignment with the standards that we've mentioned before. So SDGs, if you are a listed company in Qatar, then the Qatar Stock Exchange ESG framework, and then there's other frameworks that are more suggestive. So the GRI, SASB, TCFD, CDP, these are all, you can find these online, but it's all about choosing the right one. And the first step would be to look at which ones are mandatory in your country, and then which are relevant in your industry. And then you go from there.
Okay, I think we are at step 6, correct? Or we... It's okay now.
Yes.
Okay, I moved on to the next slide. Is that okay?
Yes, I think we can briefly just cover this and then move on to the questions. So we just gave a specific example of how this looks different in one industry versus the other. We've mentioned the variety of the ESG topics, but if we're going to look at the industry, energy sector specifically, these are some of the topics that are most material that would result out of the prioritization matrix that we've mentioned. So environmental, greenhouse gas, you need to measure and manage and report on all of your gas emissions from internal to scope 3. That is the ultimate goal. Then there's air quality management, and then there's social and governance. Health and safety is very redundant, so you have to monitor injury KPIs. You have to embed culture of safety and operations, which is something that's already being done. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, but then it goes a step further than that, and you have to ensure that human rights, ensure community engagement, and conflict-sensitive sites development. And then there's community. So are you tracking your social investments? Are there grievance mechanisms in place? Are there stakeholder engagement processes to make sure that everybody is involved in the process? And then governance. In the particular energy sector, there are certain topics that are more relevant than the others. So a code of conduct, anti-corruption policies, these are pretty common, but then you have to monitor exposure to risk-related regulations, which is very relevant to the energy sector, and ESG board oversight specifically.
Okay.
Then we move on.
Yeah. To the construction sector, right?
Yeah, we can move on to the construction sector quickly, and then head to the Q&As because we're running out of time. I just wanted to highlight how it's different in the energy sector, just to put together 2 sectors close to each other. So the energy management is also very important in the construction sector, as I'm sure you're aware. But then there's other factors like green building design and innovation. We've mentioned LEED as one of the certifications that's more relevant in construction. There's one that is particular to the GCC, which is called Istidama. And another important factor is sustainable materials. that are used into the project. Waste management is very huge. Construction is one of the most wasteful industries. So implementing on-site recycling and proper disposal of the waste material, construction material, and then there's climate risk mitigation. So to design the buildings that's resilient, specifically the GCC to resilient to heat, flooding, and sandstorm adaptation. So you're taking into consideration both the construction worker and the end user, which would be the person residing in the building.
Okay. Thank you, Sukaina. I think we'll leave it at there. And I'll take a minute to read some of your questions. And we'll also, if somebody wants to take to just have a conversation, talk quickly, it's also very doable. But let me start with this very long message from Andrew Hay, which it says, should we be expecting new roles as part of the Qatar Vision? And if you guys want to read it, it's in the chat box. Would such titles be ESG manager, ESG officer, ESG compliance auditor? Would the shift, should we expect CSR, HR, and SSG roles to be merged together? I note that ISO 14 includes, yes, procurement necessarily implement. So I'll just start by answering one by one, because there's many questions in this question, Andrew. Should we be expecting new roles as part of the Question 2030? Absolutely. Absolutely. And the way I see this is we look at their neighbors a lot, because a lot of them tend to follow some of their similar regulations. And if you would just take a small look at the neighboring countries, such as Saudi Arabia, such as UAE, such as even Oman, you can literally see. And if you, there's maybe I'll be happy to send you a skyrocket in sustainability companies, in sustainability roles. And it starts at the health and safety level. Then it moves into actually you get your own role. Then what we're seeing now is an entire department for sustainability. So to answer your question short, absolutely. And you're going to see it a lot before coming in before that. It's just moving in now. Qatar's operations are just starting as an entire nation. So you're definitely going to be seeing that, whether that's from Big Four consultants moving into internal departments. Should we see the shift with HNCS or ICC roles be merged together? Not necessarily. We don't see a merge. We don't see a merge. Will there be an upcoming opportunity to be certified or registered here in Qatar for the role of ESG? Absolutely. So you will have a lot of ability to actually get certified in different courses, let's say, or certifications for ESG. And honestly, I think DISS would be perfect to give you more insight on that. But some of these specific roles, and if I want to get technical, I know there's people listening here. I would say focus on this. First, focus on understanding what ESG is, and then the technical understanding of ESG, because ESG as a whole is a very global concept, and ESG is being modified and shifted almost on a monthly, weekly basis, right? So for a lot of people, it can be very overwhelming. This is what I would do. I would first look at where the country wants to go to, and then start there. And the reason I say that is because if you read ESG in general, where let's say Germany is right now, and then you start to say, maybe I'll embed that here, it's merely impossible. You have to start local. You probably cannot emit 100% of your GHG emissions like Sweden or like Singapore is doing, or 80% of your emissions. No, but you can start with 5%, 10%. You would look at, let's say, your first thing to be looking at is waste management. There's a lot of waste in construction. How do we start operating that on a micro level? So step by step is where I would do it. And these are the courses I would be looking to take on. I would merge a bit of technical experience with practical one, because as I mentioned, you do need both. Do you have a pairing system for professionals such as those present here today to match the companies that need support for their alignment? Yes, we do. We do. Our Viridian DISS offer this. We offer this separately. More than happy to send you this on a different basis. There's a question before that was very interesting by Laster Jude. Sorry if I mispronounced that. It says, ESG and sustainability reporting requires resources. Very, very true. In Qatar's perspective, it is not mandatory or regulatory required. It is, right? As we just mentioned, the deepest governmental function of Qatar, which is its stock exchange, means all companies that are, what is a stock exchange? When you want to get listed, what does it mean? It means you want to be at the head of what your company does. So you have to grow so much. You have to be so proactive that then you can apply to be on that stock market. This is what stock market is, right? In general, and in simple terms. And if the company itself is telling you its own stock exchange, hey, if you want to be listed, you need to create some sort of ESG report. And I'll go even deeper. Why would you even want the stock exchange to list ESG? Because Qatar at a governmental level is also at par with other nations. Forget its neighboring ones. For Europeans, for export import, you think if you want, and there was a problem, and I would look at the news with Qatar Energy when it came to exporting some of its energy when it comes to EU regulations, specifically to do with sustainability and scope emissions. Why is that? Because when you look at the stock, it means you're looking at a very high-end governmental level. And Qatar will not be able to compete, or not, sorry, I don't want to even talk about competition. Qatar will not stand at par if every other nation is giving those ESG reports and embedding sustainability, especially starting with its neighboring countries, right? So you start local, then you go macro. And Qatar has a lot of big visions. Qatar has invested heavily into places like let's say the United Kingdom, or let's say even in Europe. They have footprints everywhere. So once you get on that level, it becomes a necessity, right? And I'm just giving you why would the government care? They would care because they're making it mandatory. If your company wants to get to a place where it reaches that height, it needs it, right? Why should a company invest in reporting in ESG or sustainability closure as separate reporting from existing reporting mechanisms? Because it allows you to be, first of all, you gain a competitive advantage. Second of all, you understand that in the next 5 years, this is coming anyway. Whether, like I said, and I don't try to be mean about this, it's just that what we've seen in 2 years ago, I was in the UAE. When I was in the UAE 2 years ago, everybody threw us away when it came to scope emissions. Now we get calls every single day. Can we get the scope emissions? Can we get the scope emissions? Right? Those are the things that how do we calculate that? You could see the best way to see it. And I invite everybody to see it. The quickest way to see it is to see what type of companies are setting up shop in Qatar and in the UAE. And the more sustainability companies you see, means there's more demand for it. And then we have another one by Andrew Hay. This is a bit long, so actually no, that's
that question specifically. So outside of Qatar, there's also external pressure. If you're working, we didn't have time to mention some of the international regulation that is affecting Qatar as well. I'm not sure if you've heard about this. There's the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So it's the CSDDD, which basically would be penalizing Qatar for its supply chain, because by exporting energy, you're automatically will be affected by additional costs and so on. And this is something that you could look up, that Qatar's energy refused to abide by the new EU law, but they can only do that so far. So they essentially have won a couple of years, but within the next decade, they would have to be compliant if there's any exchange with any country in the EU.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the biggest one. We all know, I mean, everybody here that's in Qatar understands what Qatar Energy is and how it can shift the market. The second thing I would look at is the banking, right? The banking sector is also seeing a high rise in jobs in Qatar, and regarding sustainability embedding, and as well as taking loans. So Saudi Arabia does this very well, right? Saudi Arabia says, hey, if you want to take a loan to do, let's say, X amount, or you want us to back you in certain lands or in certain procurement studies, we need to see what you're doing for sustainability, right? We see this, Saudi Arabia is doing this on a very large scale, and this is what I tell everybody, if you want the key takeaway. Your neighboring countries are becoming extremely aggressive with their sustainability embedding. The reason why they're becoming very aggressive is because the international demand is demanding it. And if you want international presence and if you want growth, right, you're going to need it. It's no longer a question. This is what I would get out of everybody's head. It's no more the question of why should I? It should be a question is when and how, right? That's how I would do it. And I'm not saying you can love it or find it interesting. I'm just saying it's mandated. Most of our clients don't like it. They don't like it because it's a lot of work, a lot of data, and a lot of talks like we're doing right now. And they're like, but we need it. It's as simple as that, guys. And a lot of it is, there's a lot of actually social part of that, where a lot of people, a lot of day-to-day people like you, that we get a lot more benefits from embedding that internally. There's a lot more, and somebody mentioned that. And you know why a lot of people don't like ESG reports and a lot of these reporting and data? Because a lot of this a lot of the gaps within their company gets exposed, right? It gets exposed automatically. It's like an efficiency model for your company, and you don't realize it. But once you have the report, right, there's a reason why the stock market wants you to report on it, because they want to see, is this company worthy? Can I see, is there any gaps that they can fill, right? So that's kind of how I would have you look at it. And a lot of it is it's for Qatar now. It's not as complex, right? If you're starting now, somebody asked, does our company do it? Yes, definitely our company does it. Please feel free to reach out to DSS or us regarding these inquiries. But I'll leave you with this. You know, it's for Qatar now, I wouldn't be extremely worried, but I would definitely start to look at it as a necessary part of the company moving forward. That's all from my end. These are the questions that we've ran through. I know we don't have a lot of time. I want to thank everybody. There was 82, but all 77 of you, including us, for taking the time to do this. Really, thank you so much. This is the first here, and we're going to be very happy to do much more with DISS and give much more knowledge. And like I said, anybody who has questions, please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or through DISS. However you wish, we'd be more than happy to answer. This is our bread and butter. This is what we do on a high-end scale. Somebody asked if we have a digital software that does this. Definitely. We merge with the largest softwares that do this from the banks to do heavy infrastructure, to oil and gas. The entire sector we cover from A to Z. But yeah, if there's no further questions, thank you so much for your time.
Yes, okay. Oh, sorry to cut you off. Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much. And of course, beautiful Sukaina, thank you. I just want to address that, of course, if the questions weren't answered by Joe or Sukaina at this time, we will be answering them through email. Okay. Once again, thank you, Joe and Sukaina, for a valuable insight. And thank you for all of you for your participation in this free webinar. There's more to come at DISS, don't worry. So before we wrap up, okay, here are just a few final reminders. The recording and slides will be emailed to you along with your e-certificates. If you'd like to learn more about our upcoming training sessions on ESG, contact us at info@diss.com.qa or visit our website, diss.com.qa. So stay connected with us, okay? We are, of course, on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And subscribe to our YouTube channel for updates and future webinars, all right? So like I said, drop in your questions there. We'll be riling them up. And of course, Joe and Sukaina will help us answer them for you via email. Once again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. If there's any other questions, just drop them there. I hope and wish everyone a lovely weekend ahead. All right. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Sukaina.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.